This is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Tonight, a special program on the Moscow attack. More than 130 people now confirmed dead after gunmen opened fire on concert goers near Moscow. Russian authorities say they've detained those responsible, as Islamic State says it carried out the atrocity. But tonight, despite denials from Kiev, Russia's leader accuses Ukraine of complicity in the attack.
All those who shot and killed people were found and detained. They tried to hide and were moving towards Ukraine, where, according to preliminary data, a passage was prepared for them on the Ukrainian side to cross the state border.
On this special program, we'll investigate who's really behind the Moscow attack and what it means for the war in Ukraine, the region, and the world. Good evening. It's the worst terror attack Moscow has seen in 2 decades. More than 130 people have been killed when gunmen opened fire on concert-goers enjoying a gig on a Friday night. That number is expected to rise. Russian authorities say all those responsible have been detained and will be punished. But tonight there are questions over who was responsible and what the repercussions will be. A branch of Islamic State says it was behind this devastating attack. But despite denials of involvement from Kiev, President Putin insists Ukraine was complicit. In this special program, we'll examine who carried out the attack, what Russia will do next, and the impact that will have. Our first report tonight is from our international correspondent, John Sparks, who examines how the attack unfolded and how Russia is responding. And a warning, his report contains distressing images.
They move carefully, deliberately, their weapons at the ready, as the sound of gunfire echoes around the atrium. This is one of the largest entertainment centers in the city, and the gunmen, clad in camouflage, have come to kill. The audience were waiting for a well-known rock band to take the stage before gunfire suddenly erupted around them. Some hid behind chairs. Others flung themselves to the ground before the impulse to flee took hold. The audience rushed for the exits. Pushing, shoving, fueled by panic. But there were too many people trying to do the same. "Calmly, calmly," says one. "Exit that way, to the top," shouts another.
When I looked at the line of fire, I saw that they were not shooting at the ceiling, not into the air, but shooting directly into the crowd of people who were in the front rows of the Crocus concert hall. This is the VIP zone, the first rows. These blocks of seats, there was a crowd of people there. These were not some scattered groups of people or a few people, but it was just a crowd of people that were being shot at. I just can't imagine the scale of the disaster.
The authorities say 4 gunmen gained access to the concert hall using automatic weapons, explosives, and flammable liquids. Their operation was organized and ruthless, targeting unarmed civilians, shooting them at point-blank range. In these images, people hurry past lifeless bodies left on the floor. Streaks of blood mark the reception area, and the situation at Crocus City was deteriorating. The gunmen had set the building on fire. 30 minutes after they had launched their assault, much of this complex was engulfed in flames, with the roof over the concert hall burning wildly. Helicopters tried to douse the fire and pick up concert-goers who'd climbed onto the roof, but part of the structure would eventually fall in. Survivors were aware of their good fortune.
We are outside right now. There are a lot of people who managed to leave and save themselves. What's happening in there is a nightmare. We got out by miracle.
This monstrous attack has been claimed by an offshoot of Islamic State, an eventuality that US officials had warned about 2 weeks ago. But in a televised address, the Russian president forwarded an alternative view, suggesting the Ukrainians were to blame.
All those who shot and killed people were found and detained. They tried to hide and were moving towards Ukraine, where, according to preliminary data, a passage was prepared for them on the Ukrainian side to cross the state border.
Yet this is a major embarrassment for a strongman president. For this attack has punctured the feeling of security in Moscow that's developed over the past decade or so. In response, the authorities will act aggressively. John Sparks, Sky News.
Horrifying scenes there. Well, a branch of the Islamic State terror group has claimed responsibility for the Moscow attack. ISIS-K, as it's known, has in recent years frequently criticised Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin over Russian involvement in places like Syria. US officials say it has intelligence confirming Islamic State's claim to be behind last night's atrocity. In fact, last night's attack came just weeks after the United States publicly revealed that it had evidence that extremists planned to target large gatherings in Moscow. But in the Kremlin, a different narrative, as Russian officials point the finger at Ukraine despite denials from Kiev. Our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, has been examining the claims and counterclaims.
If Islamic State was behind this outrage, it might seem strange to many. One of the West's arch enemies attacking another. But Islamists have hated Russia for decades. As far back as 2002, Chechen Islamists were behind the Moscow theatre siege that left hundreds dead. Then 2 years later, the Beslan school siege claimed hundreds more Russian lives. Putin is despised by Islamists for Chechnya and Syria, where his air force helped the Assad regime crush Islamic State and kill many Muslims.
ISIS and its affiliates see Russia as a bitter enemy. Russia's Putin intervention in Syria in 2015 really turned the tide against the Syrian opposition, including ISIS, and basically saved President Bashar al-Assad now.
Islamic State has claimed responsibility for this, but even so, Moscow is blaming Ukraine instead.
The style of terrorist attack very much differ from the style of Islamists, so they are not Islamists. I am 99% sure that Ukrainian authorities took part in organizing of this terrorist attack.
But Kyiv and most serious observers are rejecting any Ukrainian involvement in this attack. The Kremlin itself has some awkward questions to answer. Why did it dismiss out of hand Western warnings issued 2 weeks ago? An attack by extremists in Moscow was imminent. And why did it reportedly take an hour and a half for security forces to arrive at the scene of the concert massacre? If the Russian state wasn't behind this attack, did it at least let it happen?
We've been expecting for some time the Kremlin to look for an excuse to step up its efforts to recruit people, to drag them into the armed forces. They've been resisting open mobilization for some time, and it's been anticipated that with Russia's manpower needs, because of the horrendous casualties they've been taking on the front line, sooner or later, they'll be looking for some kind of more widespread mobilization or conscription. So there is a lot of speculation at the moment that this may, in fact, provide the excuse for Russia to actually step up the war rhetoric as if it were possible to make it even more strident at home and provide an excuse for dragging more people into the armed forces.
In any other country, the idea the state could in some way be implicated in this would be absurd. But the Putin regime has shown no qualms about slaughtering innocent civilians. And the fact it is in any way plausible speaks volumes about the state of Russia under his rule.
And Dom joins us here in the studio, as does our military analyst, Professor Michael Clark. Dom, I'll come to you first. I mean, we're not really surprised that the finger of blame has been pointed here on Ukraine, despite Islamic State saying, look, it was us.
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, we have to say it's just totally unfeasible that Ukraine was involved in this. It's not the way Ukraine operates, but it is totally predictable that the Kremlin would blame Ukraine. It's hard for them to resist, but they have been making this case, as you often have with stories or events that happen in Russia, kind of flooding the zone with lots of almost contradictory claims to kind of baffle people and perplex them, but to leave the lingering impression in the minds of Russians that Ukraine was involved in this. Outside of that kind of Russian information echo chamber, no one's taken that seriously. But it's a sign of the narrative the Russians will push. And as Keir Giles was saying, there's the possibility the Russians will now use this to justify a mass mobilisation or other efforts they want to kind of bolster their war in Ukraine. So whether they were involved or not, there's going to be a huge amount of speculation about that, one way or another. I think actually what matters is they are going to use this for maximum propaganda benefits, but also to try and justify whatever moves they have planned in Ukraine next.
And I'll bring you in, Michael, on that point, the kind of options that they would be looking at now in terms of what to do next.
As far as Ukraine goes, yeah, it's interesting that this week they have rhetorically gone from special military operation to war. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, is now talking about war. I mean, a couple of months ago, he'd have got 8 years in prison for saying that, and now we talk about war. So there's clearly the Kremlin has decided, post the Putin election, where he squeaked in with his 83% again, that suddenly we're going to really mobilise for war. They're talking about another 500,000 men, of which 100,000, maybe 150,000 will be thrown into the field now after a month's training, so they'll just be pure cannon fodder. But they're going to attack everywhere at once, all together. That's the idea, to push on all fronts and to make clear to the Russian people that this is war for our homeland. That's how they're interpreting it. And so I'm sure that this event, which is deeply unwelcome to Putin, because this shows the weakness of the Russian security forces, how easy it is to make Russia vulnerable. It comes on the back of lots of other vulnerabilities that they've displayed in their oil refineries, in Kursk and Belgorod, with these incursions, which are still going on. All of that is bad news for Putin, but I'm sure that he's determined to turn it into, this is the great homeland war, and this is where we are now.
And Dom, that's also the point here, that however he sells this to the public and talks about mobilisation and what they're going to do with Ukraine next, it does show weakness. And weakness is not something that Putin reacts well to.
It does, and there are various questions that need to be answered by the Kremlin. Why did they ignore this warning from the West? It was dismissed out of hand by the Kremlin. But you could ignore that or dismiss it publicly while actively, privately, and behind the scenes, acting to prevent the possibility of the attack that the West and other intelligence agencies were warning could happen. They don't seem to have been prepared for this at all. And as Michael's been saying all day, you know, the National Guard base is very close to this concert hall. It took an hour and a half at least for them to get to the base. National Guard, you know, if there's the whiff of a protest on the streets of Moscow, they're there literally in minutes. I've seen it happen with their batons beating people down. Yeah. And yet you've got armed people in a concert theatre opening fire on people and have the leisure of time to set fire to the roof with a number of explosives, clearly. And yet the Russian authorities aren't there in any force to stop it.
And those troops were 2 miles away. 2 miles. So they could have been there within 5 or 6 minutes, even allowing for reaction time. And they weren't.
It sort of shows, you know, they're quick to crack down on dissent and yet can't actually deal with a real terrorist attack.
Hence all the speculation about were the Russians involved. And it has to be said that Putin, at the beginning of his time in office, there were a number of apartment bombings which helped him cement his grip on power that were turned out, I think most people believe, to be linked to the intelligence agencies. And therefore, this is a regime that has slaughtered its own innocent civilians for political gain. Now, in this case, most people outside of Russia, I mean, it's early to say, but most people seem to think the Islamic State claims of responsibility are fairly convincing. But the Kremlin has to explain, and has yet to explain, why it didn't get there in time, why it ignored these warnings, and it raises the possibility it knew something like this was going to happen and was going to let it happen and let it play to its advantage. I don't know if you agree with that or not, Michael, but I think, you know, it's something that the Russian authorities will... They've opened themselves up to suspicion on this, and I think it also raises the possibility we could see more of this in the future, because clearly there's a massive security vacuum in the heart of the Russian capital.
Yeah, I mean, the Russians will do these false flag operations. I mean, the apartment bombings that Dom talked about killed over 300 people.
That's right.
And that everybody is pretty clear that was a false flag operation in order to blame it on the Chechens and justify the Second Chechen War. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Would this have been a false flag? I'm inclined to think not. only because this can very easily get out of hand. I think that's a bit of a stretch, although Keir Giles, who's very good on these things, he seems to think it could have been. I suspect this was just more of a real security failure, because they didn't take seriously what the Americans were telling them. Their own security services, I mean, the SVR and the FSB massively failed. I mean, their own services should have picked up what the West was picking up.
That's the thing. Even if they do dismiss what the West was saying, surely you'd think they would be able to pick this up.
Yeah, but they didn't.
And the Islamists have a track record, as I was saying in that report, going back at least 2 decades of attacking the Russians in their capital and elsewhere. So if that warning was there, you would have thought they would have taken it more seriously, at a time particularly where, I mean, you'd have thought during wartime that Russia would have strict control of the land within its borders. But actually we've seen with the Prigozhin mutiny where they're able to march right up to 120 miles of Moscow unchallenged. There is a kind of security vacuum there. There's a kind of a lack of leadership. So maybe in that National Guard base, people weren't sure which way to turn, what they should do next. And you've also got a number of people. The Putin regime has recruited all sorts of people, from convicts to probably Islamists, all kinds of people across Russia, armed them, trained them to go to war in Ukraine. And then after 6 months, they've been able to come back and kind of disappear. And possibly Islamists are amongst them, getting armed, getting trained, and then being able to use those skills to attack Russian civilians.
Dom, Michael, thank you both for joining us. Now, joining us from Moscow is Natalia Narochnitskaya, former vice chair of the Russian Parliament's Committee on Foreign Relations, and from Kyiv, the Ukrainian MP Kira Rudik. Thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. Natalia, I'll come to you first. Devastating attack, terrifying to see some of those images from Moscow. The Islamic State has now claimed responsibility. I just want your reaction to that.
Well, I'm sure that the world Islamic movement has nothing to do with this. And behind this, absolutely, you are right, Islamic terrorists who committed this awful act of terrorism, this devilish act, the conductors are non-Islamic, absolutely. The Islamic world, in vast majority now, is sympathizing Russia, or at least keeps so-called favorable neutrality with this existential contradiction with the West. So
ISIS-K has claimed responsibility. They've put a statement out to say that it was them. So what are you saying about that statement? And the United States did warn Russia 2 weeks ago that an attack like this was imminent.
The American embassy only published on its site the warning for American citizens and American diplomats not to attend any concerts.
That's actually not correct. They flagged this. The intelligence community in the United States say they have a responsibility when they see something like this, that they flag it, and they did. And yet it was ignored. If it was ignored, why was the question is why was it ignored? And does this not expose the weakness of your intelligence service?
I believe that you shall not be so sure in what you are saying, because our official statements from the foreign ministry was that there was no warning at all. And a lot of questions were put and addressed to American side through the intelligence connections with them.
I guess the other thing that many Russians would be asking then is tonight, if the Americans knew 2 weeks ago and they issued a warning to you're saying to the American embassy, we believe they put out an intelligence statement to say that this would happen. But the fact is that if the Americans had intelligence that something like this was going to happen on concert halls 2 weeks ago, why didn't the Russian intelligence agencies have this information?
No, as far as I know, and I believe that you as journalists are not supposed to know everything, the same as I'm not supposed to know everything about real situation between two secret services, I mean, American and Russian. But the official statement from our side was that there was no warning and no information. An official spokesman for the Foreign Ministry just said that openly.
Natalia,
please, can I continue?
but regardless,
you have invited me to ask
I
me
understand, but you've made your point. Regardless of that, the United States issued something publicly through the embassy. As you say, they warned Americans not to attend concert halls because they said a terrorist attack was imminent. Your security forces didn't issue anything like that. The question then is, who do you blame?
I believe that the first question of any investigation is cui bono, who can profit from that? It's certainly not the Islamic world at all. So I will not. I heard your conversation with your guests just a moment ago, and I must tell you that such opinions that were openly about Russia and about our leadership only stimulate Russian people to be more united with the government, because for Russians, you can conquer Russians only embracing them and kissing them. When the more is pressure,
you don't believe, Natalia,
the more is the pressure, the more is the response, like a string with Russian people. Better grave than slave. I can blame. I will not. Your guest mentioned that, and you showed. I saw the program before a few minutes ago. Your program, and they say that Russians blame Ukrainians. It's only the quotation from one of political sciences. No official statement has blamed anybody now by that moment at all. But I will not be surprised. That's I say very accurate. I will not be surprised if some Ukrainian forces can be behind that, using these Islamic terrorists, because they were captured just at the Ukrainian border.
Which is what we heard.
Giving testimony, they said openly.
Which we heard President Putin say. I'd just like to bring in Ukrainian MP Kira Rudik, who joins us. Kira,
I'm not at all certain about the Ukrainian participation. Not at all. We don't know yet. The investigation just started. But they were captured. The terrorists were captured at the Ukrainian border, and they gave testimony that the corridor for them, they expected that it would be prepared, etc.
Okay, Natalia, I'm just going to bring Kira just to get her reaction. Kira, I just want your reaction, because we have been hearing throughout the day. We heard from Vladimir Putin, who said that some of the militants were captured trying to escape into Ukraine. They were apprehended, and that there are others who have linked this to Ukraine. Just your reaction.
Good evening, Yalda. Thank you so much for having me. Well, we absolutely have nothing to do with this. And you heard that Russia is usually calling black white and vice versa. And the truth is, we will never figure out what happened there. Same as nobody ever would learn what happened with Prigozhin or how Mr. Navalny died, because Russia never allows any international spectators or like any optical and international organizations to prove, or independent journalists to prove what actually happens there. This is
Kira, are you surprised though that the Kremlin, Moscow, has pointed the finger of blame at Ukraine?
No, we are not surprised at all. The truth is that no matter what actually happened, Putin will use it to his own benefit to continue the war of aggression on Ukraine and to mobilize more Russians to go and die on Ukrainian territory for the reasons that he keeps changing what's going on. Russia committed all kinds of the war crimes on our territory, and he will just keep throwing people as the battlefield meat onto this war.
Kira, what do you expect will happen now?
I do not think there would be significant changes. However, for people inside Russia, there might be additional rules and there might be additional limitations of the last pieces of freedom that they have had. I think Putin, who came to power with one terrorist attack, will continue trying to stay in power with just another terrorist attack. And he will continue the war of aggression, maybe even increasing the intensity on the battlefield.
Natalia, I'm just going to bring you back in to get your reaction to everything that Kira has been saying there, and to ask you what you think now will be some of the options that will be explored by the Kremlin.
Well, all what I have heard in recent minutes by my Ukrainian counterpart and before from your guests is, to my mind, excuse me for being a little bit rude, it's either rubbish or total ignorance on what is going on in Russia. Because we have more than 400,000 volunteers joining the army during the recent year. And so there is no need for mobilization. As far as my friends in who are very good experts in military affairs, they say that we have enough force to go much quicker to our goal of liberation of
it has
Russian
been
people
2
in
years
Ukraine from
in
the
Ukraine.
Nazism. But what I hear now, that Putin is something, I haven't heard that he eats a baby girl for breakfast and baby boy for supper to live then happily ever after. But that's rubbish. It has nothing to do with reality. Where as far as I understand, people are in Russia, even the butcher at. I'm now in the country, you see my log cabin. So the butcher in the neighborhood asked me why our president doesn't crush them all with a decadent West, with their lesbian, etc., etc. That's the sentiments of ordinary people now. So please don't think and don't persuade yourself that Russia is not
Natalia,
united and they don't like president. Of course, it's a tragedy. My ancestors' graves lie in Ukraine. My father graduated from Kyiv University, and they were all baptized in the Saint Michael Church in near Chernigov. So for me, it's also tragedy. Tragedy, of course.
Well, if we can talk about today's tragedy, because more than 130 Russians have been killed in this terrorist attack, does this not expose the weakness of your state?
No, it exactly shows and manifests the other. Since nobody can conquer us on battlefield, they do these attacks against innocent civilians. And they use these devils to kill women, children. One boy has lost his arm. Many people were burned alive. And by the way, the Ukrainian official authority, Mr. Danilov, from the security service, wrote in his social network that, oh, Muscovites are very happy today. Let us promise them to make them happy even more with the same happiness in recent weeks. This is written in his Telegram channel. Can you imagine? I don't mean that this nice lady from Ukraine, I'm looking at her face, that she thinks the same way. Of course not. But we cannot ignore such signs from official Ukrainian functionaries.
OK, I'm just going to bring Kira back in. Kira, you say that you don't think anything will change in Ukraine or in the war in Ukraine as a result of this attack. But are Ukrainian officials tonight concerned that the Kremlin could be planning something bigger off the back of this, given there are many who are pointing the finger of blame on Ukraine, despite the US intelligence, despite the ISIS statement that they were behind this attack?
Yalda, Russia is attacking us almost every night, killing dozens of people sleeping in their beds. And it didn't stop since the full-scale invasion started. So any threats or any additional statement by a Russian president, they are not scaring us. because we know that it's just constant terror that continues, and we need to figure out what to do about that. We need to get more weapons and more supplies. And on all the accusations that are coming our way, there is only one response. Unlike Russia, we are very open to public. We have many international spectators, and we are acting in defending ourselves only according to the NATO standards. And it is very easy to check. And if there were any doubts about who conducted this attack, I think this information would be already open. So we feel concerned mostly about how to protect our people against Russian terrorist attacks that happen almost every night. Just the recent ones were in Kiev and in Odessa and in Kharkiv and in Sumy, and many innocent people were killed. So we are working on increasing our defense, in making sure that we limit the victims from Ukrainian side.
Okay, Kira Rudik, Natalia Narochnitskaya, thank you both for joining us here on the programme.
Thank you, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you for watching the special edition of The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Coming up on Sky News, a roundup of the rest of the day's top stories with Matt Barbette, including the support offered from around the world to the Princess of Wales as she confirms a cancer diagnosis.